Oak Hill Cemetery. In 1850, the railroad was completed, and by 1857, the community decided they needed a cemetery, and they bought 4 acres of land from Mr. Purden, and they gave $50. You might think $50 was a lot for land back then, where in the country it was selling for $1 an acre, but this was kind of special. It was on a hill, and it was on a thoroughfare. This is the main road going to the river. It went to Doctortown, and more importantly, it was right on the railroad. And any land that was on the railroad was worth a lot of money. And in 1933, they bought more land, and they finished it out in 1936. This Carriage Drive right here, Captain Ben Milligan gave this land right here with the stipulation that no one would ever be buried there. And of course, it's still here. This is where they parked the carriages when they had the early funerals. There's over 6,000 people here in the Jesup Cemetery, but we're going mostly just looking at the 4 acres that was originally the Oak Hill Cemetery. In this lot is some of the more important people at the beginning of Jesup. Everybody in this Oak Hill Cemetery come from somewhere else. Now, these came from Hitchley, England, and this is Elizabeth Burroughs Whaley and William Henry Whaley, and they come to Jesup. He was a captain in the army, and after the war they came to Jesup, and he opened a store. He was the first postmaster in the Jesup, in Jesup's post office, and he died in 1904. This is the oldest grave marked grave in the cemetery. Is Virginia Whaley. She died of typhoid in 1872, and a lot of these right here did die of typhoid during that time. This is Henry's son, Harry William Whaley, and he was the last postmaster for the Drawdy Cemetery. The Drawdy Post Office, and then it was moved to Jesup, and Henry was the first postmaster, and Harry was the second. Harry was the mayor of Jesup. He was represented the Wayne County in the legislature, as did Henry. And this is Georgia Lee Whaley, and she was a really outstanding woman. She didn't die in 1946. She outlived Harry by 41 years. But she was, when Harry died, she took over the bank and was the director of the bank, and that was probably before she even was able to vote in 1920. But after that, she was in real estate, just as her stepfather was. And she started one of the places in Jesup that built houses, and she was very active in the community. And this is their daughter, Maud Whaley Newton, and she was the only child they had, and she did not live very old, and she died in 1945. Now, this is one of the most important people in the beginning of Jesup, and it's Willis Clary. He was born in Odom. His father, Upton Clary, run a grits mill there in Odom, and he come to Jesup after he married Lucinda Paul Lee, and he was the first mayor of Jesup. He is the one that's responsible for the county seat being moved to Wayne County. He gave the land where the First Methodist Church is. He laid out the city. He designed all the streets and the blocks. His house was number 1 in the city, and this is where Harris and Company, or Bryant Drury's office was, and that's the second house. But that's the house that Miss Georgie lived in until she died. But Willis represented, like I said, he was mayor at least 6 terms, not consecutively, but and he also represented Wayne County in the legislature. And this is Cinda Clary, his wife. She was originally married to Osgood Lee, and they had 3 children, Georgie, Helen, and Joseph. Joseph was one of the early sheriffs of Wayne County, and she had the first Sunday school in Jesup and over the Whaley building, and they actually had church there too. She was quite an outstanding woman. This is Archibald Clark's grave. He was a preacher in Virginia, and his wife got sick, and the doctor suggested that they needed to come south where it was warmer. And he ended up in Jesup. He's the one that was here when the first building of the Methodist Church was built, and he opened a school there. This was the first public school in Jesup, and and even after the new church building was built in 1930, it continued to be used as they needed it for classrooms, and they did up until Orange Street School was built in whenever it was built. And after that, they didn't need it anymore, but there was quite often classes in the basement of the Methodist Church. But Archibald also represented the county in the legislature, and he was very instrumental in the beginning of this county. This is his son, D.M. Clark, and he was a judge. Many years he lived there on Brunswick Street. And this is his wife. And D.M. done a lot for Jesup. Tell a lot about a person by what's on their tombstone. Here we have the lilies, which means a great sadness. When you see various things, here is the scroll that means something. This was a very religious group of people. And if you notice, a lot of the early graves is pointing toward the east. Okay, this is Orrin Littlefield. He had the first insurance agency here in Jesup. His office was in the Tootin building upstairs. The Tootin building is that building right across from the depot. And he is responsible for some of the subdivisions. He started Colonial Acres, which was right off of Magnolia Street. He started the Littlefield Acres, and he was very instrumental in the early history of Jesup. Okay, this is Captain Ben Milligan. He was very instrumental in the beginning of Jesup. He's the one that gave the carriage drive. They didn't own a lot of land, but they owned the best land. He was originally in the war with the Afghan Grays. He got shot in the leg, and they let him out of the army. They said he wasn't quite fit to fight anymore. But he come to Jesup, and he got all the elderly men that was too old to fight, and the young boys that was too young. And he got like an F troop, and they would do maneuvers and all. And finally, they went to Savannah to see what they could help with in the war. And they didn't know what to do with them, and so they put them guarding the gunpowder depot down the river, and they were doing that. And when Sherman come to Savannah, and they surrendered to Sherman, they forgot to go down the river and tell Ben and his group of men that they had surrendered. And when they seen some of Sherman's soldiers coming toward them, they of course shot at them, and I think they wounded 1 or 2. They didn't kill anybody. They were not that good of shots. But Sherman got really mad about that, and he sent them as far north as he could to a prison of war camp, and they stayed. It wasn't long after that the war ended, and they had to come back to Jesup the best way they could, and most of them walked back to Jesup. But Ben was very instrumental, and he owned the land where both of the Episcopal churches were. He owned where Reinhardt Funeral Home is, and across the street where the Milliken Stadium was, where the Jesup Bees used to play ball. He owned where Walmart is. Just most of the land around Jesup. But him and his family were very instrumental Wayne County and in Jesup particularly. This is Dr. Samuel Ellis's grave. He was the first licensed dentist that we had in Jesup. He graduated from the Atlanta Dental College. We had three more after him, Dr. Griffiths, Dr. Cole, and then Dr. McLaughlin come in 1916. That was our first dentist that we had, at least the first trained dentist. Okay, this is Martha Puckett's grave. She, of course, the school here in Jesup was named after her. In 1915, she started a canning club, which later on became the 4-H. She taught at 8 different schools, and in every one she started a 4-H. She was very active in the community. She helped people learn how to can, and particularly during the Depression. She was Teacher of the Year in Pierce County one year, and she was awarded the highest honor in 4-H that you can get. This is George Eustace's grave, George Sr. He come down to Jesup during the war because they had to have someone that could speak Italian, and they had across the road here was the prisoner of war camp, and he was the only one in the camp other than the prisoners that could speak Italian. The only thing left now of the camp is the VFW, and this was the dining hall where they eat. But if you notice it, the street that runs parallel here with the cemetery is called Project Street, and that's what it was always referred to, never as a prisoner of war camp. It was always the Federal Project, and as far as people in Jesup knew, that's all it was. They didn't want anyone to know that they had Italian soldiers there, and it would scare them. And it was bad enough to have the Germans coming up to Brunswick with the submarines, but to know that Mussolini's soldiers was here in Jesup would have been too much, I think. This is Ben Gibbs's grave. He was a member of Congress. He was elected in 1940, and he died fairly young in his career, and he was brought back to Jesup when they brought him on his body on the train. Senators Lloyd George, Richard Russell, and all the congressmen from Georgia escorted him to Jesup from Washington. That was a very big funeral that day in Jesup, probably the most dignitaries we've had at one time. And this is his wife, Florence Reville Gibbs, and she took his place in Congress. She was the first woman from Georgia to be elected to the U.S. Congress, and she served one term and didn't run anymore. We've had 3 congressmen, these 2, and of course Lindsey Thomas. This is Cracker Williams, Arthur G. Williams' grave. He is the one that gave the land where the Cracker Williams Recreation Center is, and that's why it's named after him. He was very instrumental in Jesup. He was county commissioner one time, and he was very well known in the county. I've been asked who was the most prominent person from Jesup, and the one that come to mind first was Walter C. Dowling. He was an ambassador and an advisor to a couple of the presidents. His name appeared very often in the newspapers and in the magazines. He was sent to Germany right after the war as ambassador, and he stayed there. And then later, after the war in Korea, he served there as ambassador. And then he come to Mercer University and taught there up until he died. But he's not buried here. His family is, but he's buried in Savannah, in Bonaventure Cemetery. One family that's buried out here is the Stows, S-T-O-W. Their son was also an ambassador. He spent most of his service as a diplomat in Bombay, India. His brother was a very prominent doctor in Washington, D.C., and he had a daughter, Minnie McCann. She was married to one of the McCann Lumber Company. She taught music in Odo. Okay, this is Lillian Nichols' grave, her and her aunt. She was a missionary in Korea before the war when it was one nation, and she was very loved over there. The only relative she had was her aunt that she's buried next to, and she was going to have to come back to America to take care of her, and the Korean government said no, they would bring her aunt over to Korea so she wouldn't have to come back, and she did, and they stayed in Korea until the war. But the nation of Korea, the government of Korea, give the stones that is on her grave. They thought that much of her. And right now, the largest Christian church in the world is in Korea. There's one that has church nearly 24 hours a day on Sunday because there's so many people wanting to go to church. And I think that she's a little responsible for that. A couple of years ago when I checked, there was 248 veterans buried out here. There's 38 that fought in the war between the states. We had 2 Spanish-American veterans. We had 45 World War I veterans, and most of that's going to stay the same now. World War II was 134 a few years ago, but that has changed, and I don't know the current number. The Korean War, we have 17 veterans here, and that too has changed. And the Vietnam War, we have 12. In the Second World War, Wayne County lost 15 men in the service, and a few of them is buried here, but very few. Okay, the railroad is responsible mostly for Jesup. Before the railroad come, there was no Jesup. It was the little community was Drawdy, and it was going toward Odom. And the railroad really started in, by 1924, there were 57 trains stopping every day in Jesup. And of course, they had to stop to get wood and water. They sold over $1,000 worth of tickets every day. And that's a lot because the tickets didn't really cost that much back then. And of course, the railroad was our biggest employer. There was every family had somebody that worked in the railroad. There were 9 sets of tracks through Jesup. The switch yard would hold 550 cars at one time, and they were constantly switching cars. This was really the center of railroad in South Georgia was in Jesup.